Greetings, this is Rebecca McCarthy, and I'd like to welcome you back to English 102 here at South Seattle Community College. Today I want to talk about the third part of our book, 1984. Part 3 shows us the rehabilitation, if you will, of Winston and Julia. That is, their torture and their reintroduction to society and their newfound love for Big Brother. Part 3 is kind of hard to read, and you might find it difficult to get through the torture scenes. At least that was my impression myself. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the hints that we've been given from Orwell about language and the power of language and how the power of language actually physically challenges how we think. By the end of this book, Winston will have convinced himself that O'Brien is a faithful helper and that he has great love for Big Brother. This, of course, is a huge turnaround from what we see in the beginning of the book. Winston and Julia's love is also destroyed, and one of the most profound aspects is that Winston accepts, against his greater logic, that 2 + 2 = 5. Key to this book is Orwell's demonstration of doublespeak and how language and history has been manipulated in order to affect memory. Now, this becomes really important because if we look at power relationships in real-world situations, you can see that if you look at totalitarian nations, there is often this technique of playing not only with the memory of citizens, but also with what logic and reality actually means. And part of the reason or part of the way that this is effective is through the use of language. And so we come to this idea or this big question about whether or not language is an effect of determinism or an effect of relativism. These are kind of strange terms, so let's break them down. First, I'm going to go ahead and define what we mean by relative versus determinism. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about language and determinism and whether or not it is effective under all circumstances. So let me start by defining the word relativism. Relativism is a doctrine that knowledge, truth, and morality exist in relation to culture, society, or historical context, and that they are not absolute. That is, knowledge is not absolute truth, and morality and the way it exists in a particular culture are not absolute. Determinism, on the other hand, suggests that all events, including human action, are ultimately determined by causes external to the will. Now, how do we apply these terms to language itself? Well, I'm going to refer to something what we call the Sparr-Whorf hypothesis. And this is a hypothesis used in communication theory and language, and it suggests that language and thought has a corresponding relationship. So the argument is this. The words that we use, the grammars that we use, and even how we use language actually shapes our thought. Now, the big debate is this. How much does how we use our language actually affect our thought process? If we do not, for example, have a particular word for something, does that mean we cannot imagine that something occurring? And right there, that last statement I made demonstrates why many people actually have a problem with this idea of linguistic determinism, because we do have the capability to imagine things that we do not have words or language for. And we also have the capability of imagining things that are outside of a certain grammar set. Now, for Whorf, he basically gave us a combination of examples through how the Hopi actually uses language compared to how English uses language. And he looked for differences in grammar in order to prove his theory. Now, I'm not going to get into whether or not this theory is absolutely correct or absolutely wrong. Actually, I don't think there is an absolute. There is a lot of study right now that demonstrates that there are some forms of determinism within language that does affect how we think. But is it as absolute as it was originally theorized? That could be disputed. Regardless, let's look at this idea, though, in relation to 1984, because it becomes very important. Two things happen. In 1984, well, actually, it'd be three things, right? Because 1984, people are indoctrinated by a constant change of history, actually changing how their brain functions and understands date and linear time. This is really important because if your history is continuously changing, then how your brain actually starts to commute that history changes. You might even have a physical change in the absolute brain, your brain makeup, which has been proven today as well, especially for how much we use technology nowadays. Our use of technology has made some of our memory functions, such as memorizing, a lot less important. The next thing we see is that we see a repetition, that things are told to you over and over and over and over again in the book. And the use of repetition as a rhetorical means of persuasion is extremely strong. Finally, we have what happens with Winston and Julia. We have torture in association to reprogramming the brain, right? So we have a form of brainwashing that is going on. Between these three different forms of approaches to affecting how a person understands their reality, we certainly have a form of linguistic determinism happening. Now that we've looked at this idea a little bit and how language actually can affect how we actually think, let's apply it to a real life situation. Certainly in 1984, we have both Julia and Winston finally agreeing to the way Big Brother wants things to be, thereby Big Brother winning this particular power relationship. And I think it's important to note that not only do we have a linguistic brainwashing experience going on in 1984, but we also have a psychological breaking down of the will of the physical body in order to reprogram the mind. Now, in most of the real life situations that a lot of us are aware of, we are lucky enough that we have not seen this type of manipulation firsthand. But you can see how the combination in 1984 of the psychological as well as the physical, as well as a repetition of continuously breaking down language and breaking down history, affects these characters deeply. Indeed, Winston finally says, after he's been rehabilitated, and I use that word with air quotes around it, after he has been let go and he's sitting in that great bar/cafe, he says, and perhaps you might pretend afterwards that it was only a trick and that you just said it to make them stop and didn't really mean it. But that isn't true. Winston admits to himself in a way that he already, it is true that 2 plus 2 is 5, and that his love for Big Brother is absolutely complete. So when we look at this text, we see that Orwell is offering us an argument that in some ways humans are very delicate creatures, especially when it comes to power relationships and authority that is not considered legitimate. So take some time to go back to the reading that I had signed earlier in this course about Max Weber and legitimate authority. And we need to remember that what is going on in 1984 is that at one point in time, does Big Brother stop being a form of legitimate authority for most of the citizens and ends up becoming a non-legitimate moment of authority. I mean, when we look at this book, many of the citizens, way before they are ever tortured, actually believes in everything Big Brother has to say. They don't question Big Brother. They don't question this mix-up of history and of language. They don't question what is happening to them at all. They just accept circumstances as they are. So for those people, Big Brother is extremely legitimate. But for people like Winston and Julia, who ends up challenging Big Brother, somehow this particular authority is not legitimate. And I think it's important for us to realize when we are writing our own papers about power relationships and we are looking at textbooks in real life historic situations regarding totalitarian governments. At what point in time is that government not legitimate because of its authority? And you can also reapply this to the concept of sovereignty, which is a concept we'll be talking about, or I will be talking about, in my next podcast for this week. Ultimately, I hope you have found these podcasts on 1984 helpful. Of course, there are many issues that we have left out, including the totalitarians and their effect and possibility of overtaking the Big Brother government, and some other major topics as well. But I have left those so that we can talk about them in our discussion section. And if you have any follow-up questions on those issues, please make sure to email me. That will be all for this particular podcast. I look forward to having you join me on the short discussion I'll be offering on this concept of sovereignty, a rather new concept for our history. Have a great day and a wonderful week, and I will see you on the discussion boards. Goodbye.